how to overcome the intermediate plateau. And what is it to begin with? Hi, welcome back to my channel if you're a returning viewer, and if you're brand new, a big warm welcome to you as well. My name is Stefani and I am a language enthusiast and a polyglot that currently speaks 8 languages. I love sharing my tips and tricks with the world, which is why I am making this video on the language learning plateau. Before I share what I think about this plateau and what strategies I have to go over it, let's first define what that is. So the intermediate plateau is something that a lot of learners report experiencing right after they have mastered the basics of language. Once they have the language core and they're diving into more intermediate material, but they're not quite advanced yet, a lot of learners say that they hit this plateau, which is aptly named because it feels like there's not much progress and you're just kind of staying at the same level of language learning. So if you have experienced that, it is completely normal. In my opinion, the plateau is not as much real as it is imaginary. And a lot of it has to do with how you perceive your own progress in language learning, because in the beginning, you're going from non-existent skills in a language to being able to have simple conversations. And then naturally, the more and more that you build on top of your previous knowledge, the less of an advancement it feels like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not advancing. It's mostly about perception. So to give an example of that, let's imagine that we have a dam, right? And so we're trying to fill it up with water, but in the beginning it's completely dry. So obviously when you get it to like half a capacity, that feels like a huge accomplishment because you started from nothing. And then once you already have this like relatively full dam, let's say you get some rainfall, right? Day one of rainfall might not be enough for it to like overflow, but you know, a little by little, if you get consistent rains, there's gonna be that last bucket of water that's gonna cause the floodgates to open. And so that's what it also feels like with the intermediate plateau. It's not that you're not making progress, and no, it's not just about that last bucket. It's just that with that last bucket, that's when you feel all of the previous ones that have been accumulating, but you didn't really pay much attention to it, or you weren't really able to feel it because it wasn't in the beginning when you're going from like dry to wet. No, now you're adding like little drops and it doesn't feel as much as it did in the beginning, but it's there, it's happening. Also in the beginning, like a little bit of a word packs more of a punch. Because when it comes to a lot of the things we do with language learning, whether it is understanding or the written word or the spoken word or speaking, whatever it is, like the first 1,000, maybe even up to 2,000 words of language are gonna pack a big punch. Just because those are words that you see everywhere. Those are words that are the most used in everyday speech. Those are words that are just useful for most interactions you're gonna have in that language. So it makes sense that they give like the most bang for your language learning buck, if that makes sense. So think of it this way. I'm an economist by training, and so that is how I feel like I can best explain this. There is this thing in economics called the law of diminishing marginal returns. And it states that, you know, usually when you kind of start out with a production in a certain company, for example, you see that you can put in some input and then you get just as much output, if not more, from those input units that you used. But at some point, if you keep having, like, say, the same factory, a number of machines or whatever it is that you have, like, in terms of production, you're gonna see that at some point you hit this like productivity peak. And from then on, the returns or the profits that you have start to diminish, which is why the law is called that way. And so they start to diminish because if you don't change anything, there's this optimal level of capacity that you reach, after which adding more inputs or more workers or stuff like that is just not as efficient as it was in the beginning. So those two things combine, the psychological aspect of it, where we don't really realize that we're making just as much progress as we were before, but also that the new concepts, words, grammar, whatever it is that we're learning is simply not as used as much as the basics, and so it doesn't feel like it packs as much of a punch, and probably doesn't. Probably, although you're still putting in the same number of work, the same inputs, the output, as in what you get in terms of skills, is kind of starting to diminish, just like it does with the economics example. So the first piece of advice that I would give in this case is to let it go. just accept that this is something normal. It is absolutely normal that the basic concepts are repeated more and more in the language, and then, once you get to the more arcane stuff, you're gonna come across it less often, and that's why you kind of learn it slower, because you're just not as exposed to it as you were before. Your optimal productivity levels, just like in economics, might have decreased, or a lot of it might be this illusion that you're not progressing, but then boom, just like with the dam, the floodgates open. So accept all of that and just keep pushing with the language. The important thing in language learning is not to give up even when you think you're not having any progress, because you are. It's just sometimes it's kind of hard to notice it. I think a lot of language learning is a psychological game. A lot of it is about unlearning what we knew before, whether through school or through the myths we heard or whatever it is. A lot of it is about making sure that you're forgetting all of those limiting beliefs, because language learning requires you to be very, very open to the language that you're learning, and requires you to have a very positive attitude and to believe that you can do it, more so than many, many other disciplines. I feel like psychology plays a very, very big part in it. So tip number one is certainly let it go. But here's some more tips. If you feel like, no, you have really hit a plateau, which can happen at any point, by the way, for some reason you feel like you're stuck and you really need to break out of it, and you do persevere and you do have the right mindset and still not working for you, here's some other tips that you can use. Step outside of your comfort zone. What I mean by that is to do something that will challenge you and that will switch it up. So if you have this method for language learning that you always use and it's working for you, do something that's a little bit radical. Because at the end of the day, what matters more than methods is your willingness to learn and the time that you spend with the language. And if you have these two things, do not be afraid to make a drastic change and switch up the method. Sometimes that's what's required, to learn things in a new way. And when your brain has gotten sort of complacent and you feel like you're not learning as much, it can be super useful to do that and even try a method you've never tried before. So switch things up and step out of your comfort zone and see if that helps. By the way, all of these tips can work together, or you can just pick to do one of them and see if it works, and then tailor it and do another and see if it works, or whatever it is that you want to do. It doesn't really matter. As I mentioned, I believe most of it is about your mindset, most of it is a psychological game, and when you decide to do those changes and switch ups that I'm suggesting right now, you can do them all together. You can try out one, you can try out another, you can do whatever you want. There's just no rules, because breaking past that intermediate plateau is not a hard and fast science. Another thing that can be very useful to do is to pick a new resource. So that can be very helpful because it exposes you to new avenues of the language. Usually new resources means you learn to talk about new topics, and that can be extremely helpful when there's this feeling that you're not really progressing much. Just kind of switch up completely the topic that you have been doing so far. If you have been focusing on business German, kind of switch it up and see if you can pick up colloquial street language. Things like that, just making sure that you're doing it with a different topic, with something that is completely outside of the range. Also, something that can really help when you pick a new resource is to make sure that you challenge yourself and that it is harder. Because a lot of times when we feel that we're stuck, we're kind of sticking to the same level of resources that are meant just for where we're at with the language, or sometimes even worse, we can be even continuing to utilize resources that are below our current level. So pick something that is a step above, for sure, above the level where you're at. Not something that is terribly difficult and would make you give up, but something that is sufficiently challenging and sufficiently new as well, but also made for a level above what you're at. And you push yourself in that way, and then you add this new resource, so the brain just gets this signal to kind of work at it harder, and it's gonna be able to pick up more of the language. Another way to fight being stuck or to fight this plateau is to do fun things again. I think that sometimes, and not all language learners do this, but a lot of us, when we get to the intermediate level, when we're trying to be advanced, we tend to be very serious. So we can even sometimes forget why we started doing that language and how we were having fun with it in the beginning and all of that. Sometimes there's this thing where in the beginning we're very excited and we do our basics, but we also do fun things, and then intermediate level comes and we're like, okay, now I need to be more serious. Now I need to do serious study of this and that and pick up these grammar rules and make sure that I can write eloquently in that language. And so we kind of take the fun out of it, and we begin to act as like serious language learners that are dedicated to becoming advanced and that are dedicated to getting past the intermediate level. But learning is most efficient when it is fun and when you're enjoying what you're doing. So if you're guilty of that, it's okay. Just realize that you've done it and go ahead and switch back to doing fun things. Because if you bring back the fun and you kind of let go and you stop being as focused on just what is it going to take for me to become advanced and doing things that you don't necessarily like as much, and you go back to the fun stuff, you'll see that you can kind of rekindle the fire and you can start to learn much more quickly and efficiently again. Tip number 5 is to do more of output. Whether you want to do more speaking or writing or thinking in that language, just a little bit more of output. That's because usually when we think of our skills in a language, we rarely think about like how well we're able to understand or to listen. Most of us are kind of using the ability to speak as a catch-all for those abilities, and most of the times that's where we see this disconnect. For example, we understand so much but we don't speak as much and stuff like that, and so we kind of tend to measure and put that as, oh, we've hit a plateau just because we can't really speak as well. And a lot of speaking / writing / thinking, because they're all outputs in that language, and so that feeling of being stuck can often be broken if you focus on being able to express yourself better in that language. Because it is true, we do tend to measure it. Even in my case, for example, right now I'm studying Russian, but because I understand so much of the language but still can't speak, I'm like not counting it as a language I speak, and although I do have some Russian skills, I do that too. I define my abilities mostly by speaking, and I think a lot of us do that. So if you focus on being able to express yourself more and dialing up the output, whether you're speaking or writing, whatever it is that you do, dial up the output, and that's going to make you feel more confident about your overall progress in the language and to kind of break that false impression that you're not progressing that I was talking about in the beginning. So focus on output, because a lot of times that's how we measure our own progress, and that's what can really, really help to get out of your head and not think about how you're stuck in the plateau. Another concept that is very useful in my opinion, and that has actually made a big impact on many of my languages, is rest days or even weeks. So there's this idea, and I think it's actually been backed up by a lot of research in workout circles that states that, like, for example, when you're working out really hard, you need a rest day to make sure that your body can recuperate and build muscle tissue better. I don't know much about that, but I do know that it is a thing, that a lot of people that are very much into the gym and working out do it, and I think that it has been quite substantially proven. What I found is that it also happens with language learning, and I found out kind of by accident when I was actually working in Spain, and I had this level with my Spanish where I was advanced, but I wanted to be more advanced. And so I felt like I wasn't progressing, even though I was living in a country and everything, and I was getting a little bit frustrated. And I came back to Bulgaria, my home country, for a few weeks of holidays. And it was marvelous when I went back to Spain. My Spanish had improved so much. I had not touched Spanish with a 10-foot pole during those weeks that I was in Bulgaria. It was just like complete absence of any language learning or practice. And I just loved how much better my Spanish had gotten. And so I feel like when you're having these rest days or rest weeks, your brain is sort of figuring out the language and kind of arranging it in your head, and you're able to better access it later when you need to use it. It's amazing. I know it sounds a little bit weird, but I do feel like the same thing that is happening to your muscle fibers when you give yourself rest days at the gym is happening to your language ability when you kind of take a step back. It's wonderful what that can do for us. I've done it several times. I take a step back when I feel like, okay, I've really hit a brick wall. And then I kind of take this step back and I do rest weeks usually. I don't do rest days. I usually do rest weeks. And then I come back to it and I'm amazed how much better that language is. So for me, those rest weeks are not necessarily with no language learning. Sometimes they are, but more often than not, I forget about that language where I feel like I'm at a plateau and I learn another. So you can do that, or you can just do no language learning at all. It depends whether you learn one language at a time or more. And then even if you learn more, you might want to take a language break from all of them. So a break doesn't mean that you cannot learn other languages. It just means you let that one go for a bit, the one that's causing you problems. And you'll see that when you come back, you've kind of jumped over that plateau to like quite a big extent. And the last tip that I have to give is, especially fitting after a break, it would be great to give your brain an exposure blast. So live and breathe that language. Everything you do will be in that language. So let's say you decide to do it for a week. All of the music that you listen to is going to be from that language. You want to see a TV show that is not like written in that language, you set yourself a rule. Okay, I'm going to only watch it dubbed in my target language. Everything that you read, if possible, you make it in your target language. Any speaking practice, you make it in that language that's stuck at the plateau. Again, just like really, that's why I call it exposure blast. And it's especially helpful after a break, because before a break, chances are you've already been working on that language and it's kind of, you feel like you've hit the plateau, you've implemented perhaps like the resource change that I was talking about, you've implemented like a few other tips and tricks, you feel like nothing's working, take a break. Sometimes the break will do it. Actually, I think always the break will do it. But then if you want to really supercharge and take advantage of the fact that your brain just kind of had the chance to recuperate and absorb the language, then hit it with an exposure blast and it works really well. I feel like, especially when you've been resting from a certain language, to immerse yourself in it and to set some hard and fast rules that any information that you consume is going to be in that language if you can help it, is very, very useful. So give it a try and let me know what you think. So there you have it, my tips and tricks on the intermediate plateau. Do let me know what you think, but I do hope that if there's one piece of advice that you take from this video, it is not to worry, because I truly believe that a lot of it is about perception rather than you hitting a brick wall in your language learning or something like that. A lot of it is about, you know, taking it easy and believing that progress is being made. But if you do want to give your language learning a little bit of a jolt, try out my other tips that I was giving in this video, because I do believe they can be very effective, in particular because they're a little bit unorthodox. And if you have found that the conventional advice with language learning and the conventional advice with the intermediate plateau doesn't work for you, I feel like unorthodox techniques are great in that case. So certainly that's what has been working for me, and I believe that a lot of it can be very, very helpful, in particular rest days from language learning or rest weeks. Don't be so hard on yourself. So please let me know if you have any residual questions after everything that I went through in this video. And like and subscribe if you liked it. I really hope to see you here on my channel soon, where I'll be making more content on the topics of language learning and overcoming the most common challenges. So I will see you soon.